1503, Vatican City. Past midnight, Swiss guard. Giovanni is patrolling toward the Pope's private chambers. This duty would normally be routine, but tonight is different. Strange sounds echo through the corridors, laughter, screams, music, and most disturbing of all, these sounds are coming from Pope Alexander VI's bedroom. Giovanni hesitates. Interfering with the Pope's private life could be punishable by death. But as a Swiss guard, he must perform his duty. He quietly approaches the door and peers through the keyhole. What he sees shocks him. Pope Alexander VI, directly beneath the Holy Cross, is having a wild party with naked men and women. The wine goblets contain more than just wine, strange colored substances. In the room, he recognizes cardinals, nobles, and most shocking of all, the Pope's own children, Cesare and Lucrezia Borgia. What Giovanni witnesses isn't just a night's entertainment. The leader of the Christian world, God's representative on earth, is doing things that would shame even the devil. And this guard doesn't yet know that what he's seeing is just a small part of the Vatican's darkest period. As you watch this video, you'll learn about Vatican scandals never told in history. You'll see how the Borgia family transformed the holy institution into a tool for personal power and pleasure, how the Pope became Europe's greatest criminal. Don't forget to hit that like button and tell us in the comments which country you're watching from. Now, let's continue with Giovanni's secret letter describing that night. The Borgia family was actually an ordinary noble family from Spain, but everything changed in the 15th century when Alfonso de Borgia became Pope Calixtus III. This pope gave special attention to his nephew Rodrigo Borgia and rapidly elevated him to the upper ranks of the Catholic Church. Rodrigo Borgia was both very intelligent and very ambitious from a young age, but his sexual life was also very active. Even while still a cardinal, he had relationships with many women and had children by them. Although this created scandal at the time, Rodrigo was covering up these scandals thanks to his powerful political connections. When he ascended to the throne as Pope Alexander VI in 1492, Rodrigo Borgia had become the leader of the Christian world. But he intended to use this holy duty not for spiritual leadership, but for personal power and wealth. When Rodrigo became pope, he had 4 recognized children, Cesare, Giovanni, Lucrezia, and Geoffrey. These children were from different women, but the Pope openly recognized them as his own children and gave them great powers. Most striking was that the Pope's relationship with these children went beyond just father-child relationships. Especially his closeness with his daughter Lucrezia raised strange questions in Vatican circles. After becoming Pope, Rodrigo's first act was to make the Vatican his family's private property. He was selling cardinal positions, taking bribes, poisoning rivals, and doing all this while using God's name. With Pope Alexander VI's takeover of the Vatican, the holy palaces began serving a completely different purpose. Now the Vatican was not only a religious center but also became the center of political conspiracy, sexual scandal, and organized crime. The first change was the arrangement of the Pope's private chambers. The rooms right next to the Sistine Chapel were now being used for private parties. These parties included not only the Pope and his family, but also Rome's wealthiest and most powerful names. The content of these parties was shocking, even by the standards of that period. Naked dance shows, group sex, drug use, and worst of all, cult-like rituals were performed. The Pope wasn't just turning a blind eye to these activities, but was actively participating and organizing them. The most famous party was the Chestnut Night that took place on October 31st, 1501. On this night, 50 prostitutes were brought to the Vatican, and crazy things were done in the Pope's presence. Cardinals competed with prostitutes while the Pope watched and enjoyed. Even after this event, no one dared touch the Pope. The most active role in this transformation of the Vatican was played by the Pope's son, Cesare Borgia. Cesare had suspicious relationships with both his father and his sister Lucrezia. This trio had made the Vatican their personal playground. What Swiss guard Giovanni saw that night changed his entire world. Giovanni, who considered himself a devout Christian, saw the Pope as God's representative on earth. But what he saw completely shook this faith. Giovanni hesitated throughout the night. Should he enter and warn the Pope? Or should he forget what he saw and continue his duty? Finally, he decided to leave the room, but the images burned into his mind wouldn't leave him alone. The next day, Giovanni wrote a letter to his family in Switzerland. This letter was found by historians and became one of the most important testimonies of the Borgia period. Dear brother, what I will tell you is very heavy, but I cannot remain silent. What I saw last night made me doubt my faith in God. The Pope, that man we consider holy, behaves like the devil himself. What I saw was so disgusting that I cannot even write it. Just know this, the Vatican is no longer God's house, but the center of sin. This letter also detailed other scandals Giovanni had witnessed. Pope's son Cesare having his brother Giovanni Borgia killed, the Pope's incestuous relationship with his daughter Lucrezia, and how the Vatican treasury was being stolen. The letter also mentioned the Pope's expertise in using poison. The Pope's private chemist, Donato Bramante, prepared special mixtures for the Pope. These mixtures were used both as drugs and as poison. The Pope's son Cesare Borgia was his father's closest partner and also his most dangerous man. Cesare was both a cardinal and a warlord. This combination was normally impossible, but no rules applied to the Borgia family. Cesare's greatest trait was killing his rivals in very creative ways: poison, assassination, accidental murders. He used every method, and Pope Father explained all these murders as God's will. One of the most famous murders was the killing of his own brother Giovanni Borgia. Giovanni was found drowned in the Tiber River because he was obstructing Cesare's plans, but everyone knew it was Cesare's work. Even after this incident, the Pope protected Cesare. Another victim of Cesare was his sister Lucrezia's second husband, Alfonso d'Aragona. Alfonso was no longer politically useful to the Borgia family. One night he was killed by unknown assailants, but everyone knew he was killed on Cesare's orders. Behind these murders weren't just political calculations. Cesare also had an incestuous obsession with his sister Lucrezia. By killing Lucrezia's husbands, he was trying to bind her to himself. The Pope wasn't just turning a blind eye to his son's murders, but was also legitimizing these murders in God's name. By saying, God punishes sinners, he was declaring his son's victims as sinners. Lucrezia Borgia was the most tragic and complex member of the Borgia family. While being beautiful, intelligent, and talented, she was also a victim of her family's political games and sexual obsessions. Lucrezia's relationship with her father, the Pope, and brother Cesare went far beyond normal father-daughter and sibling relationships. Although this abnormal relationship wasn't openly discussed in Vatican circles, everyone knew about it. The Pope constantly married Lucrezia to different men, then broke these marriages for political purposes. But during each intermarriage period, Lucrezia stayed with the Pope, and what happened during these periods created scandal. The biggest scandal was Lucrezia's mysterious pregnancy in 1501. She wasn't officially married at the time, but the Pope took her under protection. There were two claims about the father of the born child, either the Pope himself or his son Cesare. After this child was born, the Pope announced that he officially adopted him. But in Vatican circles, whispers constantly circulated about who the real father was. The most tragic aspect of Lucrezia was that although she wasn't happy with this situation, she couldn't escape. Her family used her both as a political tool and as a sexual object. Since women had no legal rights at that time, Lucrezia had to accept this situation. Pope Alexander VI was corrupting the Vatican not only morally, but also financially. He had turned the church's holy treasures into his family's personal wealth. One of his most common methods was selling cardinal positions. Wealthy families paid large amounts of money to the Pope to make their children cardinals. This money officially passed as donations, but it was actually open bribery. The Pope also abused the sin forgiveness system. Wealthy sinners could be cleansed of their sins by paying money to the Pope. Although this system theoretically existed, the Pope operated it like an organized crime network. One of the worst scandals was the Pope's usurpation of rival families' properties. He would first have the men of that family poisoned, then seize their properties, claiming they were donated to the church. Most of this money went to Cesare Borgia's military campaigns. Cesare was trying to conquer most of Italy with the resources the Pope provided. His goal was to establish a Borgia kingdom in Italy. The Vatican's financial situation became so bad that when the Pope died, there was almost no money left in the coffers. The Church's 500-year accumulation had been consumed in 11 years. One of Pope Alexander VI's most horrific traits was his expertise in poison. At that time, poison was a common method used by nobles to kill each other, but the Pope had elevated this to an art form. The Pope's private chemist, Donato Bramante, developed various poisons for him. These poisons were so sophisticated that the victim didn't die immediately, but slowly became ill and appeared to die of natural causes. The most famous poison was called cantarella. This poison consisted of arsenic, lead, and other heavy metals. When given in small doses, the victim would suffer for months before dying. The Pope used this poison not only on political rivals, but also on his wealthy cardinals. When an old and wealthy cardinal became ill, the Pope would visit him, and after this visit the cardinal would die shortly. Then all the cardinal's possessions would go to the Vatican. The most horrific poisoning case was the Pope killing young cardinals who could rival his own power. Some of these cardinals were the Pope's close friends, even relatives. But the Pope could make any sacrifice for power. The poisoning process usually went like this. The Pope would invite the victim to dinner and serve specially prepared wine. This wine contained both drugs and poison. The victim would enjoy that evening, but would start getting sick a few days later. Pope Alexander VI's scandals weren't limited to the Vatican. Other European countries were also very disturbed by this situation, but they didn't dare directly oppose the Pope. When French King Charles VII organized an expedition to Italy in 1494, overthrowing the Pope was actually one of his goals. But the Pope's political maneuvers made this plan unsuccessful. The Spanish king and queen were very disturbed by the Pope, despite coming from the same country. Especially the devout Queen Isabella repeatedly sent protest letters about the Pope's scandals. English King Henry VII was trying to minimize diplomatic relations with the Pope. He even wrote letters implying that he questioned the Pope's legitimacy. The boldest reaction came from Florentine preacher Girolamo Savonarola. Savonarola called the Pope the Antichrist in public sermons and said he should be overthrown. As a result, the Pope excommunicated Savonarola and eventually had him executed. Even the Byzantine emperor sent letters protesting the Pope's situation. The Orthodox Church was using the Catholic Church's situation as propaganda material. Faced with the Pope's scandals, opposition began to form within the Vatican as well. Some cardinals and high-ranking clergy were extremely disturbed by the Pope's behavior. Cardinal Giuliano della Rovere, future Pope Julius II, had become the Pope's greatest opponent. He was questioning the Pope's legitimacy and making plans to overthrow him. Some cardinals would secretly gather and discuss how the Pope could be overthrown. But the Pope's reputation regarding poison frightened most people and prevented them from open opposition. Some clergy working within the Vatican were documenting the Pope's scandals and secretly storing them. These documents could later be used against the Pope. The boldest opposition came from some young priests. They said the Pope's behavior was incompatible with Christian values and demanded reform. But the Pope's security network was very strong. Cesare Borgia's spies were everywhere in the Vatican. Most people who dared to oppose were either poisoned, mysteriously died, or disappeared. In the summer of 1503, Pope Alexander VI's health began to deteriorate. Ironically, the Pope who had poisoned others throughout his life had most likely been poisoned himself. The beginning of the Pope's illness was very mysterious. He had suddenly become ill after a cardinal's banquet. It was said that the Pope had drunk from the poisoned wine that he himself used at this banquet. During the illness process, the Pope suffered terrible pain. He was constantly vomiting, had a very high body temperature, and worst of all, his mind began to become confused. He would scream at night and talk to imaginary things. The most interesting thing during this process was whether the Pope regretted what he had done in the past. Some witnesses said the Pope was constantly trying to confess in his final days. His son Cesare had also become ill after the same banquet, but because he was younger than the Pope, he managed to survive. This situation showed that both were targets of the poisoning. Before the Pope's death, great chaos occurred in the Vatican. Everyone was trying to steal the Pope's treasures. Even Cesare was trying to take valuable items from his father's room. On August 18, 1503, Pope Alexander VI died. With his death, the power of the Borgia family also ended. After the Pope's death, complete chaos occurred in the Vatican. Everyone who had lived under the Pope's oppression for 11 years now felt free. The first task was cleaning the Pope's room. What was found there was shocking. Dozens of poison bottles, magic materials, suspicious documents, and large amounts of gold. The Pope's body began to decay very quickly. This situation showed that the substance that poisoned him was very powerful. The funeral ceremony was done very quickly because the condition of the corpse was getting worse. The new papal election was very tense. Cardinal della Rovere was elected as Pope Julius II. His first task was to erase the traces of the Borgia period. Cesare Borgia lost all his power with the Pope's death. He was first arrested, then sent into exile. Finally, he was killed while fighting in Spain. Lucrezia Borgia married the Duke of Ferrara after her father's death and moved there. There she tried to live a relatively normal life, but the shadow of her past never left her. The Vatican's financial situation was very bad. The new pope had to work for years to fix the church's finances. Swiss guard Giovanni left the Vatican after the pope's death. What he had seen had affected him so much that he could no longer work in this place. After returning to Switzerland, Giovanni wrote a detailed testimony report. This report became one of the most important first-hand sources of the Borgia period. In the report, Giovanni wrote, "I worked in the Vatican for 11 years. What I saw were things no Christian should see. The Pope used his family and the holy institution for personal pleasures. God's house became the center of devil worship." Giovanni also recorded in detail the murders, poisonings, and sexual scandals he had witnessed. These records have survived to this day and are very important in understanding the Borgia period. The most interesting part was Giovanni's personal observations about the Pope. The Pope was a very intelligent man, but he used this intelligence for evil. He knew people's weaknesses very well and used them for his own benefit. Giovanni's report also showed how the Pope was not repentant. Even in his final moments, the Pope was not repentant. On the contrary, he said he wanted to live longer and commit more sins. The effects of Pope Alexander VI and the Borgia family period on the Catholic Church continued for a very long time. This period greatly damaged the Church's prestige. The most important effect was laying the groundwork for the birth of the Protestant Reformation. The reform movement started by Martin Luther 14 years later frequently referenced the scandals of the Borgia period. Martin Luther argued that the Catholic Church needed reform by listing the Pope's sins. The scandals of the Borgia period became one of the strongest materials of Protestant propaganda. In Europe, kings began to question the Vatican's authority. This situation led to the strengthening of national churches and the reduction of the Pope's political power. There were also effects in the field of art and culture. The Borgia period was both the brightest and darkest period of Renaissance art. Artists on one hand benefited from the Pope's wealth, on the other hand were disturbed by the scandals. The most lasting effect was psychological. The Christian people largely lost their faith in the Pope's innocence and holiness. This loss of trust weakened the Church's authority for a long time. Pope Alexander VI wasn't the only scandalous pope in history, but he can definitely be said to be the worst. There had been problematic popes in previous periods, but none had reached this level. During Pope John VI's time, 1370 to 1415, similar scandals had occurred. But that Pope only committed personal immoralities, he hadn't established a systematic, organized crime network. Pope Innocent VIII, 1484 to 1492, was the pope immediately before Pope Alexander, and he too had children. But he wasn't as open and systematic as Alexander. What separated the Borgia period from others was the magnitude and systematic nature of the scandals. Pope Alexander had made sinning a lifestyle. Also, the Borgia period was much better documented thanks to technological developments. The spread of printing had enabled scandals to spread much faster. In subsequent periods, popes began to behave more carefully, learning from the Borgia scandal. The Church worked for a long time to repair its image. The scandals of the Borgia period didn't remain in the past. Today's Vatican still lives under the shadow of this period. The modern Catholic Church is now much more cautious about the Pope's sinlessness. The personal lives of popes are monitored much more carefully. The Borgia period also contains important lessons for today's political leaders. Absolute power can lead to absolute corruption. It's the best example of how power can be abused when left uncontrolled. Pope Alexander's story shows how institutional corruption begins and grows. At first, small immoralities can turn into big crimes over time. The most important lesson is that no one is uncontrollable in the face of power. Pope Alexander saw himself as God's representative and thought no rules applied to him. The importance of separation of powers in modern democracies is better understood when considering the scandals of the Borgia period. The Borgia period was very important, not only politically and religiously, but also in terms of art and culture. Pope Alexander was a great art patron, but this patronage was intertwined with scandals. Michelangelo, who decorated the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, began working during the Borgia period, but the artist was very disturbed by the Pope's scandals. Leonardo da Vinci worked as a military engineer for Cesare Borgia. Some of the inventions he made during this period were used in murders. Raphael's famous frescoes decorated the Pope's private chambers. Although these frescoes are famous for their beauty, it's very ironic considering the horror of the environment they were made in. The most interesting cultural effect was the writing of Machiavelli's book, The Prince. Machiavelli, modeling Cesare Borgia, wrote about how morality could be ignored in politics. This period was also when the contradiction between art and morality was most clearly seen. The most beautiful artworks were being produced in the worst moral environment. And so, what Swiss guard Giovanni saw that night wasn't just one-night scandal. It was a small part of the Vatican's darkest period. The story of Pope Alexander VI and the Borgia family is the most horrific example of how power can corrupt. The world's holiest institution had become the most sinful place. This story teaches us this: no institution, no person is immune to corruption in the face of absolute power. Even the most sacred places can become hell in the wrong hands. Giovanni's testimony also shows how history's dark periods are documented. If it weren't for that brave guard, we might not know half of these scandals. The importance of power oversight and transparency today is better understood when considering the scandals of the Borgia period. No one, no institution should have absolute power. Finally, this story also gives us hope. Even the darkest periods eventually come to an end. The Vatican reformed itself after the Borgia period and is a much more transparent institution today. If you enjoy these kinds of dark history stories, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. You can write in the comments which historical scandal you're curious about. Let's continue learning these shocking truths of the past together. In the next video, we'll cover the story of the queen who bathed in blood. Till then, let's remember how power can corrupt and appreciate the value of institutional transparency.